Hello and welcome to another episode of Brave UX. This is Brendan Jarvis, managing founder of The Space in Between, and it's my job to help you put the pieces of the product puzzle together, unpacking the stories, learnings, and expert advice of world-class UX research and product management professionals. My guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Allen. Elizabeth is a Toronto-based researcher, consultant, and educator with over 13 years of experience helping organizations to uncover insights that fuel smarter design decisions. She holds a PhD in cognitive psychology from the University of Chicago, and she has also lectured there in psychological and philosophical ideas of consciousness. Elizabeth is an active contributor to the global UX community, speaking at conferences such as UXNZ, Web Directions, and Interaction. She is the co-chair of the User Experience Professionals Association Conference, a content advisor for the UX Research Conference, and also a mentor for Hexagon UX. Before starting Brazen, her UX research consultancy, Elizabeth worked as a UX researcher at Shopify, the e-commerce platform that powers over 1 million businesses in 175 countries, working across chatbot and point-of-sale products. Now she helps clients from around the world, including Mozilla, Instacart, and Shopify, to challenge assumptions and shape better products through research. You can find Elizabeth at brazen.io and on Twitter at ElizAllen_. Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Brendan. It's nice to be here. And also, I'm so rarely introduced as Dr. Elizabeth Allen. I appreciate that. It makes me feel very special today. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. My wife's actually a doctor, and I always feel like it's appropriate to give respect to the qualification. Look, before we get into the serious stuff, I read somewhere that you play the banjo, and I figured that there's got to be a story there. How did that all come about?
I actually have my banjo's right behind me, but I promise I'm not going to play it. So this must have been maybe 10 years or so. I had a friend whose uncle was a banjo player and who had a band and was kind of exposed to it that way. And I just thought it sounded great, and I was really interested in it. And I would play with his banjo occasionally. And then I think for like maybe some birthday or something, I treated myself to a banjo and been playing sporadically ever since. I live in an apartment, so I can only play so much without feeling like I'm bothering other people. So I'm not quite at where you'd expect for someone who's had a banjo for 10 years, but it's like a nice, very non-screen using, nice, very like analog, non-technology thing to do in my spare time.
Yeah, it's so important to get a bit of time away from the screen, particularly when you work in tech like we do.
Yeah.
Now, look, obviously, aside from playing some banjo, you've got your own consultancy, and you're also very active, as I mentioned in your introduction, in the UX community. And when I was researching for this interview, I obviously came across the Hexagon UX website, and there was a quote on that website that really floored me. I actually posted about that on LinkedIn recently, and the quote was, "In the United States, which neither of us are from, fewer large companies are run by women than by men named John." And like I said, it really floored me. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about, what is Hexagon UX?
Oh yeah, Hexagon UX is an organization operating in Toronto, and I think a bunch of other cities around North America, or if not the world, which is basically a kind of a mentorship sort of program. They might do other things as well, but I was involved in mentoring there, and essentially pairing up women and people of marginalized genders with other individuals who can mentor them in, I think, generally different aspects of tech. So in my case, I was paired with a young woman who was kind of getting started as a UX researcher and just kind of needed a bit of coaching and advice along the way. And it was really great. It's a really kind of laid back organization, a nice way to make connections. I had a really good time mentoring. They kind of provide you with a bit of a framework for kind of every week or every other week, what sorts of things you might want to do together and that kind of thing. And there's a little party at the end. So yeah, it's just a really nice kind of locally run organization that I had a great time being a part of, because I find that as a woman in tech, it's really important to me to be at least somewhat of a role model for other people. And so that was kind of a nice, easy way to kind of give back a little bit. It's one of my goals for the year was to try to do a bit more kind of volunteering or mentoring or something like that. And sometimes it's hard to set that up on your own. So it was nice to have a kind of bridge to that sort of experience.
Yeah, to have an organization that you believe in to plug into.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of things in your experience can people in tech do to better support diversity, whether that's women or people from marginalized genders or different ethnicities? What sort of things can we do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot. I think one is being the sort of place that those type of people would want to work at. So, for example, like having really strong codes of conduct in place. Having an HR team that's obviously committed to addressing issues with that. I find that I find that as a woman who has looked for jobs in the past, if I go on a company's website and I see that the leadership team is like 90% male or 90% white or whatever, then I'm probably not going to be as interested as if there were a more diverse team, right? And so I think it's hard for organizations sometimes because they've gotten to a point where they have that kind of problem and they want to fix it, which is cool. But that doesn't mean that I, as the kind of employee, should have to sacrifice whatever environment I would rather be in for that cause, if you know what I mean. So I think that's important. And also another thing that I think a lot of companies do is kind of talk about the pipeline problem. There aren't enough of those sorts of people out there that we want to hire. And the problem is that there aren't enough of you, not that we're, being exclusive with the way we hire or something. And that's almost never the case. There are certainly, biases people have in terms of who they choose to interview, like what kinds of decisions they make based on resumes, things like that. And like a lot of barriers that people of different genders or racial backgrounds or ethnicities or whatever have to kind of cross in order to just even be seen by these organizations. And I think unfortunately there's still a lot of education and work to be done around helping these companies understand that it really isn't our problem, it's your problem, and it's your job to fix it. And we have a lot of benefits we can bring you as a company if you just take a second to consider us as you would your kind of straight white male, individually you typically tend to hire. So yeah, so I probably have a lot more thoughts on that. That's about all I can share at the moment.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, it just strikes me when you see quotes like that, and I know that they're speaking in the broader context, that people seem to be ignoring the research out there that proves that diversity is so much better for creative process, whether that's product or design. And it's just how do we actually make that a reality? Like you say, visibility is a bit of an issue, and one of the objectives I have for this show is actually to make sure that it's representative, not of what we have now, but what we need to have in terms of the people that are getting the platform and getting some visibility. So
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wanted to ask you, I also was looking back at your UXNZ 2019 talk, which was a really great talk, by the way. And you were describing your PhD experience as something that you, quote, wouldn't recommend to most people, end quote. But you didn't elaborate on that at all. You sort of just rolled into the rest of your talk. And I just wanted to ask you, tell me about that. What was it about that you wouldn't recommend to most people?
First of all, that's funny because I usually when I'm giving a talk at a conference, I'm pretty much not retaining anything. I'm just talking. I can't remember what I'm saying. So it's good to know that I just kind of breezed past that and moved on to something else. So I did a PhD in cognitive psychology. It took me about 5.5 years, which is a bit faster than I think a lot of programs are. And that included a master's kind of along the way. And I personally had a great experience. I had a fantastic advisor. He allowed me to kind of, do whatever I wanted to do. I had a lot of friends in the program. For me, it all went quite well. But almost the whole time I was doing the PhD, I was like 99% sure that the outcome of this I wanted was to have a lab, be a professor, do academic research. And so that was the way I would get to that goal. Then about maybe 6 months before I finished my PhD, I kind of had a bit of a freak out where I realized like, this is not what I want. Like it's, the academic job market's very difficult. I'd probably have to move somewhere that I didn't really want to live. I wasn't necessarily so in love with the research problem I was focused on, and it would be hard to change. There's kind of other things I was thinking about. And I managed to find UX research, and that's obviously been a good career for me. But I would definitely say that you should only do a PhD if you really are like so very sure that you want to have an academic career and that you're pretty sure you'll be able to get the job that will get you there. Otherwise, I would suggest maybe doing a master's or something like that instead. And you could always maybe extend that if you really feel like you do want to do a PhD. But in my case, I have no regrets, but if I had left after maybe 2 years with my master's, I probably would be, kind of better off in my career than I am today because I would have had those extra few years in the job market. So that might have helped a little bit more.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's really interesting that you say that, just that extra time that you would have had. Was there any particular person or moment that you recall where you had that freak out that prompted that?
Honestly, I don't recall, but I just remember kind of waking up one day and being like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I think certainly one factor at the time was I had a partner and I was like, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to, move to be with them, or, how are we going to kind of work that out? And that was something that was on my mind, of course. And I think also just, you spend 5.5 years researching the same sort of idea and it just might not be as exciting as it was at the beginning. And so I think I just kind of did some Googling around to kind of be like, hey, what can you do with a psychology PhD? And luckily UX research is a really good fit for a lot of people. And I'm really glad that I found it.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously you bring a lot to it in terms of your academic background and the sort of rigor that goes into that level of research that you produce for your PhD. How important do you believe it is to have an academic background as a UX researcher?
I would definitely say not so important that you need a PhD. That part is like, that's too much. You don't need that. Having some background is useful. I wouldn't necessarily say it's important. I think what it helped me with personally was getting comfortable with writing. So I had to write a lot, and being a good writer is important for being a good researcher because you have to convince other people to take your research seriously. Getting comfortable with presenting stuff. So as part of any sort of advanced academic degree, you probably have to give talks and stuff to your lab or at a conference or whatever. And that helped a lot. And also honestly, just developing my kind of critical thinking skills, like understanding how to frame a problem and what sorts of ways to approach solving the problem, like doing that in kind of a formal way over and over again certainly helped a lot. But that being said, you can get those sorts of experiences in a regular job as well. It's not just coming from academia. I think that one other thing, I guess, that I feel like academia gave me was a kind of broader context to kind of embed myself in terms of like human behavior and psychology and whatever. Like, I studied my particular problem, but I was also taking courses on social psychology and developmental psychology and philosophy and things like that. And that kind of all somehow fed into who I am today, right? And I feel like those were all beneficial experiences. But at the same time, I could have spent those 3 or 4 years after my master's at a job that could have taught me a whole bunch of stuff I don't even know that I don't know now. So it's hard to say.
Yeah. So now you are a UX researcher. How do you think of your purpose as a researcher?
Ooh, that's a good question. I remember my first UX research job, I worked at a consulting firm called Centralis, which is in the Chicago area. And I believe it was Kathy Kaiser, who's one of the partners who leads Centralis. I believe it was either her or Lyman Casey, her partner, who said something like, I feel like one aspect of my job, at least, is kind of eliminating those tiny little frustrations that occur in someone's day. Like it's really satisfying when you can kind of, you're doing some usability testing or something and you uncover a particular issue and the client or the company has no idea about this. And you're like, oh, they can solve this problem relatively easily. And it's going to eliminate some little frustration from thousands of people's days. And that's really cool. That's one kind of aspect of that. It's more, it's a little bit more patting myself in the back, I guess, but it's kind of a nice feel good aspect of what I do. But honestly, I feel like, instead, now that I've been doing this for longer and doing a lot more kind of generative research and kind of foundational research, I find that what gives me a lot of the kind of good feelings these days is this idea of a company coming to me and being like, we don't know anything about our users. Like we have this cool idea, or we have a start of a product, but we don't actually know who we're designing for and what they're like. And being able to show them like those people kind of, like holistically, almost like, you know, lots of aspects of their lives, doing like a really nice deep user interview project where I can kind of be like, hey, here's all the things you should be considering when you're designing for this group of people. I find that is really rewarding, and also usually really rewarding for the client, which is great, because I mean, I find that that feeling of giving a client their first experience with research is like really awesome. So that's the kind of work I like to do a lot of.
Yeah, and I think it is important to have that clarity of purpose. And you mentioned usability testing, that sort of immediacy of the impact that you're having, even if it is effectively just removing problems. And that if there were no problems, you wouldn't get that feedback, which would be success, which is quite a weird thing to consider, that your job is basically to remove that friction at that level.
Yeah.
You know, what other common misconceptions that you've come across that people have about what it is that you do as a UX researcher?
That's a good question. I mean, people still talk about focus groups a lot, and they assume that I do a lot of focus groups. I just talked about this today with somebody, and it's funny because not that focus groups are not valuable in certain specific contexts. Like, I'm not saying never do a focus group, but that's very little. I think I've done one focus group project in the past 3 years, right? It's a very small amount of what I do. I think that when people who have never maybe worked with a researcher before hear about UX research, they think about the evaluative stuff, the usability testing, and that kind of thing, like A/B testing, like, oh, I have a prototype and I need you to test it. You know, those kind of smaller projects that are kind of in the solution phase. You kind of already decided, this is my solution. Now I want to make it, you know, tweak it to make it better. Whereas really, like, where I prefer to operate is more in the problem phase, right? Like, even understanding what the problem is and who we're trying to solve it for, right? That's like where I'm kind of more comfortable. And so I feel like people have maybe a more narrow view of what UX research is and what's involved. Let's see, another thing that's been coming up a lot lately is this idea of throwing a survey at most of your problems. Like, surveys or something, everyone knows what a survey is, right? Everyone's experienced a survey. It's easy for them to grab onto that as something that they should be doing, which surveys are great. I'm not bad-mouthing surveys at all, but they're not great for everything, right? You know, like you and I as researchers know that surveys are great for, you know, getting a little bit of information from a lot of people, right? Asking relatively simple questions, getting relatively simple answers. And it's not until you start to have a conversation with someone that you can really dig deep and kind of understand the things you would never have thought to ask in a survey, right? And so I think that a lot of people are like, well, you know, with a survey, I can get responses from thousands of people. That's better than doing 5 interviews or 10 interviews or whatever. And in some ways, it is to answer certain questions, but you're going to miss a lot if you just jump into doing a survey. And so that's something I've kind of, you know, butted my head against a lot over the past couple of years, probably.
Yeah, and how successful have you been in shaping that conversation?
I think pretty successful. I think one of the good things about being a consultant versus working in a house somewhere is, like, I think I'm viewed as an expert, and people are like used to this idea of kind of paying me for my expertise or my thoughts. And so they're probably more willing to trust me. Whereas if I was in-house just working as a researcher somewhere, there's probably a little bit more arguing and pushback that's going to happen, I think. And so it's worked out pretty well for me. Not every client goes for it, because usually interview projects are going to take longer time and they're going to cost more money than running a survey. So, and also you of course run into those people who just are never going to be convinced by something that's not numbers, right? They want to know 73% of people chose option C, right? They don't want to hear the reasons why option C was important to them. They just want to know that's what people say. And
Yeah.
so that does come up sometimes. I think that, you know, over time you kind of get better at having those conversations. And I think also over time, people, non-researcher people, get more exposed to research and they kind of start to understand. So they still might have a more narrow view than what I would want, but they're starting to kind of get better, I guess.
Yeah. So, like, if you imagine that you're talking to an internal research team at the moment that's having some of these issues that you've just spoken about, what would be some advice that you would offer them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing that I do with kind of stakeholders that's most convincing is try to show them the risk that's involved in not doing the thing that I want them to do, right? So let's say we decide not to do this research or not to do research at all. What are the risks? What could go wrong if we make an assumption about this group of users and we're really wrong, right? Is it just a small thing? Is it just, you know, a couple people will be upset? Or is it like we could kill somebody, right? There's kind of a lot in that spectrum.
Yeah.
And so having companies think through risks and kind of realizing, hey, wait a minute, like, there's a lot we don't know about, and and if we don't learn this stuff, we're going to be in big trouble. That's important. And there's an activity that I like to do with clients sometimes, called the Assumption Slam, which is something I picked up when I worked at Shopify. And the idea is that you have kind of like a 2x2 grid, and one axis is like riskiness, like low to high, and the other one is kind of like knowledge or confidence that we have about this, like low to high. And the idea is you start to brainstorm all the kind of assumptions or hunches or hypotheses you have, and you stick those in Post-it notes on that grid, and you kind of argue about where they should be placed and that kind of thing. And what happens is you have this quadrant that's like high risk and low knowledge, and that's where you should really be researching, right? Like, we don't know anything about this, and if we get it wrong, we're screwed. So that's kind of like a good way to kind of, if you do that activity with a company, they might be like, oh, okay, I get it now. That's kind of like a good visual way to lead them through that. So an exercise like that would be something I could recommend to an internal user research team.
Yeah, that sounds really valuable. Was that called the Assumption Slam?
Yeah, it was called the Assumption Slam, and I'm pretty sure that the first time I heard about it was from JB Booth, who works at Shopify. So I don't know if she got that from somewhere else, but I think that's the first time that I heard about it. And it's super useful, and it like generates a lot of arguments.
Yeah.
Which are usually good conversations.
Yeah, hopefully in a cathartic way that everyone feels better afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
So just to add on, another thing that I find is really valuable for internal teams is, if you're working with stakeholders who don't believe that there's this problem that needs solving, then of course, like, exposing those stakeholders to the end users in a, kind of easy and safe way can be great, right? Include them, let them watch the interviews, grab quotes to put in your presentations, like, let people really see these are the real people, and they're really having this problem. Definitely, in the past, I've had situations where, like, I've done some research and the team is really on board, but then I go to present and the CEO is there and they've been totally not involved in the research at all. And now they're there and they're like, oh, well, you must have just recruited, stupid people, essentially. Like, you must have just recruited the wrong people. These are people that don't know how to, use a phone or whatever. But then when I show them the videos, they're like, oh, okay, these seem to be typical regular people, and they're having these issues. We've got to fix that right now. So that's another technique I would suggest in that situation.
Yeah, so that's observing a usability test or something similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
We talk about it as this notion of making the user real, as a way of, I suppose, removing the bias or the assumption that goes behind some of those perspectives, and getting people in the room is really valuable. So we've been talking a little bit about stakeholders, and I know that you've worked both internally and as a consultant. What are some of the key people in a product-based organization that you need to connect with and get across the research? Who do you really need to build great relationships with if you're in a product-based organization?
Yeah, I mean, I would say number one is probably the product manager or whoever's making product decisions. That's the kind of closest or easiest for you to influence, which is often the product manager, I find. Like, when I worked at Shopify, I was kind of spoiled because we worked on these really great teams that were comprised of a UX researcher, a data person, a designer, and a product manager, and also a content strategist sometimes, which is like the perfect, like, kind of UX bundle. And we would make a lot of decisions as a team, and it was super, super great. Not every organization has that, of course. I find that I feel most successful on projects when I have a good relationship with a product manager. And if there are designers on the team, it's also really important for me to be involved with them too, especially if it's an evaluative project where they're, creating prototypes or something. Of course, I want to be able to, communicate my findings to them in a good way. But also sometimes a higher level than that. Like, I find that especially as a consultant, usually whoever's hired me directly, like the product manager or whoever, has, someone they're reporting to, or maybe even a higher level above that, who's, they're kind of like, oh, we're spending money on this consultant. Let's, I want to keep an eye on that as well. And that can be scary sometimes, not gonna lie. But it's also great because I feel like the chances of the results of my research actually making an impact and actually, resulting in a new thing, they go up like a whole bunch if I have those higher level stakeholders involved. So it's usually hard, it's harder to get them involved, especially with the kind of day-to-day aspects. Usually they just kind of show up for the final presentation, which, isn't always the greatest. But if I can have that conversation with them and get them interested, then like I'm usually much more confident that something's actually going to come of this, as opposed to, other projects I've done either in-house or as a consultant where, a couple of years passed and I'm like, oh, what happened to that thing? And, they just never did it.
Yeah,
So
you
I think
got to
there's
bring.
still some things from my very first UX research job that like never, you just check the website every so often and you're like, no, they just didn't, but that's okay.
Yeah, and that can be quite disheartening as a researcher, because a lot of effort and energy goes into running the research and then figuring out what the insight is behind it. It's something that I hear time and time again. And I think like what you're saying about making sure that you're connecting with product people, but also with any sort of more senior stakeholders is really important. And as a consultant, possibly like part of survival as well, in terms of actually being able to continue working for that company. When you're seen as an experience. Yeah. You mentioned some of your previous places that you've worked, and I also discovered that you worked at Prosper, which is, from what I read anyway, it was the first peer-to-peer lending platform in the USA. What advice, if you were to give advice to someone that was in a similar position of establishing the research practice like you did, would you offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So just for context, for anyone who's listening, I was the first research hire at Prosper, which was like a kind of, I guess, medium-sized startup in San Francisco. So they did a peer-to-peer lending or marketplace lending. So basically, I want to borrow money, and instead of borrowing it from a bank, I borrow it through Prosper, and my loan is funded by investors kind of all over North America, or at least USA, in kind of these little chunks kind of. So they're kind of investing little bits in my loan and I get the money in the end. Anyway, and they hired me as their first researcher, which was kind of the reason why I wanted that job. Like I love the idea of building a research team from the ground up and kind of getting all these processes in place. And it was fantastic, but it was also really hard. And some things that, that were difficult. Number one was everyone wanted a piece of me, right? Everyone wanted to do research. They never had research before. And they kind of knew that like, oh, Elizabeth is here. We should be doing research. So I'm going to contact her about research.
And this was, sorry to interrupt. This was 10 years in, right? They'd existed for 10 years before you joined, and they'd never run any research.
I guess, yeah. So I don't remember, honestly, it was a few years ago now, so I don't remember much about like the kind of origins of Prosper, but yeah, they might have been around for 10 years. I'm not sure, but, but certainly when I came around, however, they were probably at least a few hundred people. They had definitely never done any research as far as I know. I'm sure they might've hired out for some consulting, but they never had an internal researcher. Yeah. And so, so everyone wanted to do some research. And I really had to set boundaries very quickly. And in my case, it really helped that I had a manager who helped me do that, right? He pretty much totally empowered me to say no to everything that I wanted to say no to. And saying no was the most important thing I did there. I basically said no to whole like sections of the business. Like, I mean, my manager was kind of like, hey, this part of the business is what's highest priority right now. And like, use that information as you will. And so there were these poor product managers who would be asking me for research for like a whole year. And I just would say no every single time because they just weren't quote unquote important enough to me, sadly.
So you were really popular.
I was really popular, but I also had to maintain those relationships because, I worked with them and I liked them. And luckily it was all fine. No big hard feelings there, I don't think, but just kind of, doing that work to kind of prioritize which teams or what research questions are really important and saying no to everything else was very useful. I think also almost like paradoxically, I also had the issue of everyone wanted research, but not everyone trusted research or thought research was a good idea, right? So I was kind of dealing with both those things at the same time. And so it was also important for me to kind of get some quick wins, basically. And so I did that in two ways. One was running a really, really fast, like evaluative research study on I think it was just their website. I think maybe just their marketing site, just like a really quick, like within a few weeks of me starting there, I was like, okay, bam, here are some research results. And we learned from them and we made changes really quickly. So that was part of it. And the other part was kind of making my research visible across the company in terms of like, this is of course before the pandemic, bringing users into the company, doing research in the office. Like we had a, nice glass walled, kind of box to work in, and I would bring people in to do usability testing or do interviews, and everyone could watch, everyone could see I'm bringing the participant in, Elizabeth's doing research today. And I think that was really helpful as well, to show really quickly, like, we are getting research done at Prosper. And so that was really cool. So I think that those things were really important. And also documentation. So I had the opportunity to start from scratch, right? Which is a really exciting opportunity. And so the company was already using Confluence, and because they were already using Confluence, I figured let's use their tool, because I didn't want to make everyone use a new tool. So I created a Confluence area, or whatever you call it, that was a repository for all the research, and kind of highlighted, when this research was done, what the key insights were, and then here's all the information if you need it, and kind of tried to organize it really well. So that was a really cool experience. And then I think I only was there for about a year, and by the time I left, I'd hired one person, and then ideally we were going to hire more, but Shopify just reeled me in too quickly, and I left. But it was really cool. I mean, I think that I would not take that position if it's your very first research job. You should have some experience already, and then you will hopefully be successful in a role like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, seeing what you've seen, having been, the first researcher at a company, setting up the practice, having worked at Shopify internally for a couple of years, and now externally as a consultant for a range of organizations, what capacity have you seen that's most effective for the organization, or is there a mix of capacities that can work?
Sorry, when you say capacity, what do you mean?
What model is most effective for an organization that's trying to do UX research, whether it's bringing in external consultants or an internal team, or some sort of mix in between?
I get it. Okay. Yes, definitely. So I would say that it seems like a lot of companies start with the consulting thing, which makes a lot of sense, because you don't always have the money or the time to hire an in-house researcher right away, or maybe you just don't have the need to just yet, right? And so that's a really good way for companies to start off. They can kind of hire someone like me to kind of come in and very quickly execute a research project, right? And that's usually enough to get people excited, and then maybe it builds momentum to hire a researcher kind of down the line. I think that having one researcher in-house is a great first step, but I think that ideally you would pretty quickly hire at least one other person to kind of back that person up. I have friends who have been in the same situation I was in, where they were the only researcher, and if there's a lot of demand at the company, it can get overwhelming pretty quickly, especially if they don't have the authority to say no to projects, and they end up working crazy hours. Once the company gets bigger, like Shopify, for example, obviously a big company, it's nice if there's a researcher or a team of researchers who kind of focuses on one product area, right? So at Shopify, we had what are called product lines, and I spent a lot of my time working in the retail section, basically. So anything related to selling in person with Shopify. And it was just nice to be able to own the research for that particular area, right? Like there's like a kind of pride in that. And also you just get to really deeply know the team. I think a lot of other companies operate where researchers are kind of more like internal consultants, where they go off and do projects for different teams. And that's okay if you don't have, not every company has enough researchers, but if you're a bigger company, I loved that I was dedicated to solving this one kind of universe of problems. I didn't have to worry about everything at Shopify.
Yeah.
And that was really useful. So I think once a company is big enough to kind of scale that way, then that's a really good place to be in.
Yeah, that does seem to be the two models that operate out there, isn't it? Sort of like the research team is internal, but they operate as their independent squad, and then they solve research briefs for product as and when they come in, or as and when they pitch ideas to research. Or there's the embedded model, and I can definitely see the benefits of both. I just wanted to turn our attention to your UXNZ 2019 talk, which I've mentioned, I think, a couple of times now, but I really did find it fascinating, because in that talk, you were speaking about some of the pop psychology myths that exist around color, which is a very specific thing. But in that, you gave an example of an A/B test, an early A/B test that had been done within an interface where there was a change from a green button to a red button. And you were using that to highlight context as being really important in interpretation of results. And in this case, I think it was a 70% increase in clicks happened because they changed, to a red button, but largely because the interface was all green. Lots of elements on the interface were green previously, so the button sort of blended in and now it contrasted and stood out. And so it seemed like you were worried that there was a tendency, or at least a reality out there, that there was a bit of skin deep analysis going on, and sort of people were ignoring context or oversimplifying the results of research.
Yeah, I think that when people recognize that they have a problem, they want to get to that solution as quickly as possible, right? So I'm not surprised that people will kind of grab on to what they think is the simplest and easiest way to to get to the bottom of something. Yeah, and in that particular example, this was a situation where someone did this A/B test, compared a green button to a red button, found the red button was quote unquote better, and was like, okay, red is the best color to use for these buttons, without, as you mentioned, without considering the broader context in which those colors were displayed, right? And there was all this green stuff in the background, so the green button kind of blended in, and that was a very likely alternative explanation for this. And if they tried other colors, maybe they would have found that orange is just as good as red, or blue is just as good as red, or whatever. And so I think that, I think people are drawn to that kind of simple A/B testing, or like really simple, evaluative research, because they think they know what the problem is, and that's the quickest way to solve the problem. And so, it's just, and I don't blame these people, right? If I was a product manager or someone in that kind of situation, I might be inclined to run the same sort of test, and I might not have thought of the surrounding context. I think that's why it can be helpful to have teams where maybe one person is not going off and doing this stuff on their own, but you actually get collaboration and bring this up in a meeting or something and talk about, like, hey, if we were to run red versus green, what could we actually conclude from this? Could we conclude that red is the best color, or do we just know that not green is the best color, for example, right? And where should we go from there? So yeah, that talk was really fun, because I got to talk about all this cool color stuff, which I don't think about, very often, because my degree was such a long time ago. But it's just kind of interesting to take that, those little bits of academic knowledge and kind of, try to dive into how they can apply to, real problems that, product teams are facing every day. And that was just when I saw that example, it's in a whole bunch of, blog posts and stuff. And I'm just like, oh, come on, there's such an easy alternative explanation for this. Come on, think harder.
Yeah, I had a nightmare that I was going to wake up one day and fire up the internet and find that all interfaces had red buttons, and that was just how design was going to go. But thankfully, that hasn't happened. But I think it's really insightful. That question of I think you said do we really know that it's red buttons perform better than green, or is it that any other color could perform better than green, and that sort of level of rigor that you put into the questioning that goes around these decisions. And it seems to me that there's a huge pressure that particularly product managers face around the roadmap and the backlog. And I wondered if you had any more insight into that, having worked at product organizations, as to what other sort of behaviors do you suspect might drive that kind of rush to implement solution without necessarily thinking too much about the reasons why.
Yeah, I find that, I don't know every product manager, but I find that many of the product managers I've worked with are just trying to do too much in a year or a quarter or whatever. And that's not their fault. They're obviously being told to do certain things. And so often when I look at a roadmap, I'm like, can we cut this in half? There's just no way to do all these things very well, right? Especially if you want research to inform them. I often end up in these situations where, people want research immediately because, next week they're supposed to, make a change or whatever. And I'm like, no, if you want to actually do the right research, this is research that needs to happen. Like if it's generative research or kind of more deep foundational research, it has to happen before to inform the roadmap. We don't even know what the roadmap should be. You have to do the research first. And that can be, really hard to get across in kind of a maybe less mature, product organization. Really, the product manager or the product director or whatever, and the researcher should be kind of paired together, because the research should inform what the product direction is, right? And, kind of vice versa. And so I think, I have a lot of sympathy for people who are working under those kind of roadmaps and deadlines, because yes, it is very tempting to just do the bare minimum research you need to do to kind of tick the box of okay, boss, I did some research. And it just sucks, because doing bad research is worse than doing no research, right? If you do poor quality research or research the wrong thing, then, who cares? I think it was Erica Hall. I might be getting this wrong, but I think it was Erica Hall that said something like, if you set up your shop in the wrong problem space, then like kind of who cares what your solution is? It's a solution to the wrong problem, right? And so I think that what a lot of companies don't do is kind of spend more time in that problem phase and kind of noodle on that for a longer time before jumping into solutions. At the same time, I understand, because companies want you to do things and make money, and it's hard to be like, let's just sit and think about this for a few months. So
yeah, this is a real area of tension that exists between product and research, and I think from what you were saying anyway, it sounds like having a bit of empathy for the product manager and understanding the pressure that exists around that need to deliver, particularly when you've got to generate revenue or stick to a roadmap, is really key. But it also sounds like maybe the conditions that create this tension between research and delivery effectively are outside of both the product manager and the researcher's role of responsibility. And perhaps they exist somewhere else in the organization, and there's a job to be done there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, a lot of companies have grown without any sort of kind of research culture baked into them, and trying to tack on research later involves changing a lot of mental models and changing a lot of, kind of behaviors that are deeply ingrained. And yeah, the product manager, him or herself, might be totally on board with doing the research, but if they're getting pressure from someone above them to move more quickly and they feel like they can't push back on that, then, then that's what's going to happen. They can't really do too much about that. And it's unfortunate.
Yeah. So on that note, like if as researchers, what could we do to help the product managers more effectively manage that and I suppose enhance the maturity of the organization over time?
Yeah, when I started a new company, I like to do stakeholder interviews. So I would hopefully have a decent relationship with the person above the product manager. They'd at least know who I am and why I'm here and why they should listen to me. So I think building those relationships will be important. And I think also just like, developing the relationship with the product manager themselves, so you kind of make sure to back each other up, or like inviting each other to meetings where, like, if the PM knows that he's going to have to make an argument that's going to be difficult for them to make alone, then they should bring me along and I can kind of speak to the research aspect. Because, probably the best way to convince the stakeholder to do the research is to talk about risk and what happens if we don't do the research. And maybe I'm the best person to speak to that, and we should have that relationship going so I can be involved in that part as well.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that's a really important point, because both roles are effectively, and everyone involved in a product is trying to deliver a world-class result. And if you can back each other up and see, rather than the tension existing between yourself and the other party, and rather it's something else in the organization to address together, I think that's quite a powerful way of framing it.
Yeah,
so we were just talking a little bit about the maturity of different organizations and their response to research. There's something that I've observed a lot here in New Zealand, at least, is that it seems that there are a lot of UX designers who have possibly come from UI, at least initially, that are running research themselves. How do you feel about that?
In general, I feel great about it, because, the more people who are familiar with research and getting their hands dirty with research, the better. But there's some caveats to that, right? I think a lot of designers are kind of pressured to do this sort of research without really having the kind of training or background. And that's obviously not so great. I think also companies sometimes think they can solve their research problems by just having their designers do usability testing or A/B testing on the stuff they're creating, but they're not taking the time to have someone come in and do the more generative or foundational work that kind of feeds down. So like in general, I think it's great if a designer is willing and able to do their own evaluative research. That's kind of a nice piece that they can kind of like take and do on their own. But the idea of them also doing foundational, like kind of longer term, deeper research, that's probably going to take too much time and effort. They have their design job to do. That's probably going to be pretty difficult. And so, yeah, like I'm all about people doing research as long as they know what they're doing to some extent. Like, for example, right now I have a client who my client's an agency who has a large corporate client who they're running a program right now to teach people in the corporate client how to do kind of design thinking sort of activities, right? Like how to run certain types of research, how to kind of do design thinking stuff. And they're actually working on their own problems to solve. They kind of have a project to work on. And it's great. Like I'm teaching this, I spent this morning teaching journey mapping to these people who are like everything from, IT people to, people working in the stores or the branches of this company, like people who are not involved in research at all, but they're all getting a chance to do interviews and do journey mapping and whatever. And I think that's great because they're going to take that and bring that to their role in some sort of way, or bring that to another company they work for. And it doesn't mean they're going to be research experts, but they're going to have a lot better background than, someone just kind of coming in off the street and trying to run a usability test. So, yeah.
Yeah, and teaching something that seems to be quite a big part of your career. I mean, obviously in academia, you were a lecturer, and I know you've got your own training that you deliver. I think you also work through O'Reilly Media, so that's obviously quite a big name in terms of training and other sort of insight that they provide. And you've got your UXNZ usability testing workshop. I believe it's called Mastering Usability Testing. Is this something that's designed for a broad audience or for designers, or I mean, who really are you trying to reach through this training?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think of the audience for this research to be, people who have not necessarily done any of their own usability testing before, or maybe have, but don't really have a strong grounding in it, but either need to do it for their job or kind of imagine that in the future they would want to do it for their job, right? So the idea is that it's a half day, like 3-hour workshop, and we go through everything from like defining your research questions, like understanding why you should be doing this sort of research in the first place, to coming up with, how we're going to structure our tasks, how we're going to recruit participants, when we actually run the sessions, how do you get someone to open up and talk to you? How do you not be biased in the questions you're asking? When you get the data, what do you do with it? Like, how do you make sense of all that data? And then how do you turn that, that kind of synthesized data into like, okay, here are like the 5 or 10 like top insights and recommendations that kind of come out of this. So basically everything from like getting the first idea to maybe do some research to like, okay, stakeholder, here is what we should do as a result of the research. And so like, I think I've taught this sort of thing a bunch of times before. And typically I find like designers, product managers, sometimes content strategists, sometimes developers, and definitely like newer UX researchers or people who want to transition into UX research as a career.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's next month. I think it's on the 17th or the 18th of November. And you're delivering it online, am I right?
Yeah, so I mean, in an ideal world, I'd be in New Zealand like I was last year. I actually taught the same workshop at UX New Zealand last year, and it was wonderful. And this year, of course, not doing that, so it's going to be on Zoom. Yeah, it's at a reasonable time in both New Zealand and in North America. So hopefully everyone in Europe will be able to attend that too. Hopefully, it'll be a decent time for most people.
And if you were going to give people some sort of top tips or insights that they might get from that workshop, what would say your top 3 tips be as a result?
I think writing good questions is really going to be useful, and I find that's probably the biggest benefit, because you can use that for not just usability testing, but also interviews or surveys and other kinds of methods, right? Like how to ask a good question is actually harder than it sounds, and getting people to open up in the session. So building that rapport with a participant, making them feel comfortable, listening actively and like responding to their body language, that kind of stuff. So that kind of like in the session, how do I, think and respond to what people are doing? That's going to be a big chunk of what we talk about. And I mean, I guess just in general, the importance of planning. Like, I think most of what I talk about in this session is like, here's how to plan for X, Y, and Z, which is not the most exciting thing to talk about all the time. But if you have a solid plan going into it, you're going to have a good result. Like, the worst thing to do is to do a usability test or whatever type of research, and then you do all that work, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute, why didn't we ask about this? Or like, why didn't we think of this? And that's because you didn't have the time to plan, or you didn't take the time to plan, right? So making sure you come up with a research plan that like, has your goals in mind, your research questions in mind, and then figuring out how you're going to get the answers to those research questions through the testing is like a really important part of this.
Yeah. So what sort of mistakes have you seen when people are planning or running research?
Yeah, I mean, not involving stakeholders. So coming up with a discussion guide for an interview, for example, but they haven't gotten the feedback from the people who are going to actually be consuming the results of the research. So they go and they give their presentation at the end, and they're like, and some CEO or whatever is like, wait, but why didn't you ask about the thing? And you're like, oh, I didn't even know I was supposed to ask about the thing. And that's, that's obviously a big deal. I think not knowing how to deal with people's reactions in testing. So this doesn't come up that often, and certainly less with usability testing than interviews, for example. But if someone gets emotional or upset during the interview for whatever reason, how do you handle something like that? That's something that people certainly make mistakes with. Like if someone starts crying, like not even acknowledging it and just kind of pushing forward, or if someone is not giving you the responses that you want, ending the session and not giving them an incentive or something like that. These are kind of things that hopefully most people realize they shouldn't do, but people do it. And also just, I mean, a big mistake people make is doing all the work to do the research, to get all the data, and then just not doing anything with it, right? Like we did the research, we have 100 pages of notes, but we don't have the time to actually piece through this and get the insights out of there. So that is definitely a pitfall.
Yeah, I mean, it also sounds like a massive waste of time and energy of everybody involved.
Yeah.
So when we were talking earlier, you mentioned how it was important to use the right methods for a study, and that sometimes people come to you and they think, oh, let's run this survey. The survey is going to solve all of our problems. And it sounded like you were able to sort of walk them back from that solution before you get going. So when someone comes to you with a brief or with an idea that they need to run research, what is the first thing that you do?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to find out is what are the goals of the research? Like what, regardless of what method you want to use, what are you actually trying to learn? And maybe that does not match up with whatever method they have, they've chosen, which is totally fine. A lot of people, they haven't done research before. They know maybe a couple of things they're familiar with. And so maybe to them, it's totally reasonable for them to, I don't know, do a survey to find out what kind of workflows people use to open a Word document or something like that. But that's not really a great survey question, probably. What a weird example I just picked off the top of my head.
I love it.
And so, yeah, I'm clearly staring at Word right now on my computer. So, I mean, I find that like, yes, that part's important. I think that trying to kind of help them think through, not just what the goals of the research are, but like what the outcome, what they're going to do with the outcome of the research. Like, is, what's the point of doing, for example, a nice, really broad, like foundational research project if you already know that you are going to be forced to design this very specific solution, right? Like maybe there's no point in spending the time doing that really great research if you're going to not be allowed to use the results, right? So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Luckily, I find that most people are not in that kind of situation, but yeah, I mean, I think that some people just don't know what kind of methods are out there. And luckily, as someone who's done a lot of this, like I can use my expertise to kind of be like, hey, a survey is great. Let's do a survey later because of these reasons. But I think let's start by talking to some people, because there's going to be some things we'll learn through these conversations that will inform our research, our survey questions, and make that survey much stronger if we do that later, right? So just kind of talking through my rationale, I think, is important.
Yeah. No, this is really valuable. And you're obviously someone who has some depth of experience in both qualitative and quantitative methods.
Mm-hmm.
Is qualitative research not taken seriously enough?
Sometimes. It's getting better. I think it's getting better. It also depends a lot on the company, of course. I think that a lot of people balk at qualitative research at first because of the small sample sizes. I mean, like people are like, what? We're going to do 8 interviews. Why don't we survey 10,000 people instead, right? And so you kind of have to help them understand like both methods are great for answering different questions. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, even if I have a company or a client that's like totally all in on qualitative research, they still want to like kind of quibble sometimes about exactly how many interviews we're going to do or exactly how many sessions we're going to do. And the way I tend to pitch it as is like, we should keep doing these sessions until we stop learning new things, right? Or stop learning enough new things. And so maybe we start with 6 or 8 or whatever, and we can always reevaluate and be like, you know what, this is still really interesting. Let's keep going. So yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's always going to be a challenge for some people to accept qualitative research, but I think it's getting easier the more people that are exposed to it.
So Elizabeth, what is it that you enjoy most about being a UX researcher?
Ooh. I think I mentioned somewhere earlier in the interview, this idea of showing clients their users or their prospective users for the first time. That's probably the most exciting thing. I love when I do a project and a client is like, I feel smarter now. Like I feel like I've learned something that I wouldn't have learned before. That's like the number one thing. I also I love my sessions with the participants themselves. Like tomorrow I have 4 user interviews scheduled, which is like probably plenty given that I have other meetings during the day as well. But like, I'm going to enjoy those 4 conversations. I get to talk to people who I wouldn't normally encounter necessarily, right? Like a lot of the projects I do are with people that I just don't meet on a daily basis. Like, I did a project last year where I spoke to people who coordinate clinical trials for hospitals, for example. Like I would never get to learn anything about being a clinical trial coordinator, but I got to talk to like probably 6 people who did it, and it was really cool and a very complicated field to be in. So I enjoy that. I enjoy, in my case, because I'm a consultant, I enjoy working in different industries. So, I get to become an expert in, peer-to-peer finance for a little while, and then I move on to healthcare, and then I move on to e-commerce or whatever. And that's really cool. I find that like I've amassed a breadth of knowledge that's been really useful. And like in particular, because I've happened to work on a lot of e-commerce projects and worked with Shopify a bunch, that kind of gets me a reputation, which gets me more work in e-commerce. And I, kind of get to kind of further refine that expertise, which I enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you had to label one thing as something that you enjoy the least, what would that be?
Recruiting, I don't really enjoy. Yeah, recruiting I don't enjoy because there's this kind of waiting period where like, I have people I want to recruit and I have to wait for the responses, and I have all these slots open on my calendar and I'm waiting for people to sign up, and I hate blocking myself that way. Or maybe I have to get a third party recruiting vendor to help me out, and then I have to, get a big chunk of money from my client to help with that. And that's kind of annoying. Yeah, I find that recruiting is just like, I'd rather not deal with it, but I have to.
Yeah, that comes up so often, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure anyone enjoys recruiting, even the recruiters.
No.
So what I thought we'd do is now that we're sort of winding down our chat, I thought we'd play a fun game. Well, hopefully it's fun.
Okay.
Well, you be the judge of that. And it's called, what is the first word that comes to mind? And so I'm going to say a word, and I want you to reply with the first word that comes to mind for you.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I think so.
Okay. UX research.
Happy.
Product management.
Confusing.
Nickelback.
Canadian, unfortunately.
So you've run a lot of research. You've been with a lot of participants. I think you mentioned, and I'm not sure if it was an example, that a participant may have cried before. That's obviously not funny. But what is the funniest thing that you've observed as a user researcher?
Okay, the first thing that comes to my mind, which honestly I shouldn't even say is funny. I feel kind of bad saying it's funny, but I did an interview with someone who presumably ran a small business of some sort, but I didn't know much about it. And during the interview, he basically confessed to me, I think he was telling the truth, that he was some sort of like hired assassin for the government, and that he had a very dark past life where he had killed people. And I mean, again, I shouldn't say this is funny because I don't know. I mean, if it's true, it's not funny. And also if it's not true, it's also not funny. So, take with that what you will. But it was certainly the most memorable, I guess, session that I had.
Yeah, it sounds really weird. And I suppose you've got to be pretty prepared for that sort of stuff to happen when you're dealing with people that you don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So if you could give yourself some career advice, so think of the first day that you started as a UX researcher. If you were able to tweet yourself one tweet of advice to you on that day, what would you say?
I would say, be open to learning, speak slower, stop interrupting people.
I love
Because
it.
I've gotten better over time, but I definitely had more trouble at the beginning doing the kind of active listening and not, trying to jump in with my next question because I was just nervous, basically. And I still struggle with it sometimes, but I've gotten better.
Yeah, don't we all? Well, look, Elizabeth, it's been so great having you on the show. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for being so generous with your experience and your expertise. There's so much great advice here. I really can't wait to go back through this video and prepare the show notes for everyone. So to everyone that's tuned in, thank you as well. Everything we've covered today, including Elizabeth's workshop at UXNZ next month in November, will be linked to, and all the other fantastic resources that we've mentioned. If you have enjoyed the show, please remember to subscribe to the channel and to like and comment on this video, and we'll keep you up to date with all the other amazing interviews we have lined up. Elizabeth, is there anything you want to say before we finish up?
No, I don't think so. Just thank you so much, Brendan, for the opportunity. It's just it's nice to meet someone who who actually remembers a talk that I did and wanted to speak to me because of it. This is very rare, and it's just nice to talk to you. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Elizabeth.